Last session, we introduced Create, Protect, Deliver, a single mental model for seeing the digital enterprise as one system doing three things simultaneously at every important boundary. We closed with a question that comes up every time this model is introduced. Is this another framework we now have to learn and maintain on top of everything we already carry? The short answer is no. And the reason why goes to the heart of what this session is about. Chapter 5 is about the operating system underneath Create, Protect, Deliver, the architecture that connects intent to execution. It introduces the 7 minimum viable capabilities that make the living system governable, explains why boundaries matter more than value streams, and shows how evidence, not documentation, is what actually creates resilience. Let's start with the problem that makes all of this necessary. Think of the digital enterprise as a layered structure. 3 distinct layers, each doing something different, each dependent on the others. At the top, the strategic layer, the level at which boards and executives think about growth, survival, and what the organization is trying to create, protect, and deliver. In the middle, the operational layer, where work actually gets done, capabilities get exercised, and value gets produced or lost. At the bottom, the compliance layer, the frameworks, standards, and regulatory requirements that represent accumulated external guidance about what deserves attention. Most organizations treat these as 3 separate worlds, each with its own language, its own reporting cycle, and its own definition of success. The architecture this session describes is what connects them, not by adding another layer, but by threading a single beam of light through all 3 simultaneously. But first, a question that cuts to the heart of why that connection matters so much. Picture a supplier update pipeline. In the paper system, every major framework requirement is checked in green. NIST 853 satisfied. ISO 27001 satisfied. SOC 2 satisfied. ITIL satisfied. The compliance record is clean. Now picture the same pipeline in the living system. The data flows through the same nodes, but at one point, something happens that the green checks above never captured. An unverified anomaly. A behavior that the compliance layer documented as covered, but for which no one ever established a mechanism to detect, verify, or respond to in real time. This is exactly the pattern behind the SolarWinds attack described in earlier sessions. The paper system documented compliance at every node. The living system lacked the mechanism to learn, the evidence loop that would have caught the anomaly before it became a breach. The failure was not a missing control in a catalog. It was a missing evidence loop at the exact point where trust was assumed rather than verified. This distinction matters enormously because it tells you where to look when you want to close the gap, and what not to reach for when you're tempted to add more controls to the paper system. So what is the right thing to reach for? Not a replacement for the frameworks on the shelf. NIST CSF, ISO 27001, COBIT ITIL, these represent real, accumulated knowledge about what deserves attention in digital operations. Discarding them would mean throwing away decades of hard-won collective experience. What's needed instead is connective tissue, something that takes the frameworks already in place and connects them to the way the organization actually creates, protects, and delivers value. Not in theory but in practice at real boundaries under real conditions. That's the role the operating overlay plays. It doesn't ask you to memorize a new control catalog. It doesn't replace the standards your auditors and regulators expect to see. Instead, it sits between those standards and the operational reality they're supposed to govern, asking at each boundary what this requirement actually looks like when things are working, and what would tell us if they weren't. This is the distinction that changes everything. An operating overlay versus a replacement. And it addresses something most organizations already sense but can't quite name. We described in the last session how most organizations run 3 conversations: growth, operations, and risk, as if they were separate concerns. Each has its own vocabulary, its own reward system, its own definition of what good looks like. The operating overlay treats those 3 conversations as 3 layered views of exactly the same system, not 3 separate systems that occasionally need to be reconciled. At the board level, that view is create, protect, deliver, the strategic frame for what the organization is trying to accomplish and what it must protect in the process. At the operational level, that view is 7 minimum viable capabilities, the functional clusters of work required to actually run a living system that learns and recovers. These are what the living system lacked when the paper system was documenting compliance. Not more rules, but the mechanisms to sense, respond, and adapt. At the compliance level, that view is the standards and frameworks that already exist now serving as a reference library rather than the primary measure of success. A single business initiative running through all three layers simultaneously. Growth, risk, and operations as three perspectives on one thing, not three departments managing three different realities. That reframing starts with something even more fundamental: what the enterprise actually is. Here's an observation that sounds simple until you sit with it. Create, protect, and deliver are not governance constructs that someone invented. They're a description of what every living system already does in order to survive. Any enterprise that stops creating eventually becomes irrelevant. Any enterprise that stops protecting its value eventually loses it to risk, fraud, or regulatory action. Any enterprise that stops delivering reliably eventually loses the trust of the people depending on it. These three things aren't aspirational. They're operational necessities, which means the model isn't asking organizations to do something new. It's asking them to see what they're already doing more clearly, and then govern it accordingly. This holds up under pressure. Push external requirements against it, the demands regulators make, the constraints operations face, the threats that emerge in the environment, and the model doesn't break. The three dimensions flex and adapt, but the underlying logic holds. An organization that can create, protect, and deliver simultaneously at its most critical boundaries is, by definition, a resilient one. That realization led to a further one. The model wasn't describing governance as a discipline. It was describing how living systems survive. And surviving requires a specific operational engine. Every boundary failure, when traced carefully to its root, reveals a gap in one of 7 functional clusters of work. Not a gap in documentation, a gap in actual operational capability. Govern. Setting the intent and the outcome measure pairs that define what good looks like at a specific boundary. Plan. Understanding the capacity, constraints, and resource requirements needed to hit those outcomes. Design. Building the patterns, architectures, and standards that create the conditions for success. Change. Moving from current state to improved state without introducing risks that outpace the ability to detect and contain them. Execute. Running the patterns reliably day after day, under real operating conditions. Assure. Continuously sampling evidence that the system is behaving as intended, not just documenting that it should. And innovate. Incorporating what's been learned from all of the above to improve the system over time. These 7 are called minimum viable capabilities because none of them is optional. Remove any one, and the system develops a predictable failure mode. An organization that can execute brilliantly but can't assure will eventually be surprised by drift it never detected. One that can plan and design but can't change effectively will find its designs aging in place while the environment moves on. The 7 capabilities aren't boxes on an org chart. They're the work itself. Most governance and risk programs are organized around value streams, the broad horizontal view of how a product or capability makes its way from idea to customer. That view is useful for understanding the overall journey. It's less useful for identifying where risk actually concentrates. Risk concentrates at boundaries, specifically at the transition points where one system hands off to another, where human judgment overrides an automated pattern, where governance intent meets the reality of operational behavior under pressure. Think about what actually causes failures. Not the smooth middle of a value stream, but the API handoff between 2 core platforms during peak load. The human exception approval that overrides a standard pattern at quarter end. The internal system handing data to an outsourced provider whose behavior under edge cases nobody has verified. These are boundaries. And they're where the 7 capabilities have to actually work, not just be documented as working. Shifting the unit of analysis from streams to boundaries is more than a semantic change. It changes what gets measured, what gets tested, what gets owned, and what gets reviewed when something goes wrong. And at each boundary, 2 very different sets of questions need to land in the same place. Take a specific example: the board-level outcome of protecting settlement integrity at Meridian. From that single outcome, two very different groups will derive their work, and they often use entirely different questions to do it. Engineering and product teams ask what and how. In practice, that might be: does reconciliation complete within the required processing window? That's a functional, operational question about whether the system does what it needs to do. Risk and audit teams ask, how will we know? In practice, that might be: where is the immutable evidence of completion, evidence that couldn't be altered after the fact, that would hold up under regulatory scrutiny? Both sets of questions are legitimate. Both are necessary. The problem is that in most organizations they're answered separately, producing two separate measurement systems, two separate evidence chains, and two separate definitions of what success looks like at the same boundary. The quality outcome, quality measure structure, the QOQM tree, is what ensures both groups are hanging their distinct operational questions from the exact same business outcome. When that connection exists, engineering and audit aren't working in parallel universes. They're producing complementary evidence about the same thing. And that unified evidence is what feeds the loop that makes the system learn. Here's the question that separates governing by documentation from governing by assurance. When an exception occurs at a critical boundary, say a manual override in Meridian's settlement processing, what happens next? In a documentation-driven system, the exception generates a closed IT ticket. Someone files it, marks it resolved, and the system records the event without changing. The paper system now shows the exception was handled. The living system learned nothing. In an assurance-driven system, the same exception is treated differently. It travels through a loop. The evidence of what happened feeds into a learning cycle which refines capability, which updates the intent the outcome measure pairs at that boundary. The output isn't a ticket closure. It's a design pattern update that shapes how the system handles similar situations next time. The loop has 3 points: intent, capability, and evidence. Intent sets the target. Capability executes toward it. Evidence reports back on whether it's being hit, and forces an update when it isn't. The critical word is forces. Evidence must force learning, not suggest it, not enable it. Force it by making it impossible for the organization to look at an anomaly, close a ticket, and continue operating as if nothing changed. That forcing mechanism is what turns a system that documents events into a system that learns from them. There's a persistent belief in many organizations that assurance and speed are in tension, that the rigor required to verify that things are working will always slow down the rate at which things can be done. Disney's approach to managing its parks and resort operations offers a useful counterexample. Managing more than a dozen parks, over 40 resorts, and more than 100 million visitors annually, Disney operates in an environment where a technology failure isn't just an operational inconvenience. It's a direct disruption to the guest experience that the entire business is built around. Their key insight was treating assurance not as a retrospective compliance exercise, but as active, operational evidence generation. Frameworks like ITIL weren't treated as rigid control catalogs to be satisfied on paper. They were treated as patterns to be tested in live operations, continuously, not annually. Supplier dependencies were treated as operational realities that required ongoing verification, not contractual assurances that could be filed and forgotten. Post-incident reviews were designed to produce genuine pattern changes, not just ticket closures. The result? Assurance became the mechanism that made speed sustainable. Not by slowing things down, but by ensuring the organization learned fast enough from what actually happened to keep moving forward with confidence. In high-performance environments, assurance is not the enemy of speed. It is what makes speed safe. A natural concern at this point is scale. 7 capabilities applied across all critical boundaries, grounded in outcome measure pairs, with learning loops that force design updates. This can sound like a massive organizational undertaking before a single result is produced. It doesn't have to work that way, and in practice the organizations that succeed with this approach almost never start big. The thin slice strategy starts with one boundary, not the whole value stream, not the enterprise. One critical transition point, and a handful of outcome measure chains defined at that boundary. Step 1. Define the boundary. Pick one critical transition point and define a few outcome measure chains. What are we protecting here? What would tell us if we weren't? Step 2. Inject into operations. Run an end-to-end experiment inside the normal flow of work. Not a separate transformation program, not a new team, not a dedicated initiative with its own governance. Run the loop inside what's already happening. Step 3. Produce evidence that travels. Prove that the feedback loop works at this one boundary, that evidence leads to learning, and learning leads to design updates. Then take that proof to the next boundary. The thin slice approach does something important beyond managing complexity. It produces real evidence early, evidence that the model works in practice, not just in theory. And that evidence is often what opens the door to broader adoption. There's a layer of the living system that no compliance framework has ever successfully captured: the layer of human behavior under pressure. Consider 3 questions that reveal whether the assurance loop is actually running, or just appearing to run. First, do near misses get shared openly, or quietly managed to avoid documentation? The answer tells you whether the organization is feeding honest evidence into the intent layer, or shielding the intent layer from the truth. Second, who stays silent during change reviews? The people saying nothing are often the people who know something is wrong, but don't believe it's safe to say so. That silence is system data. It's evidence that the culture is filtering what the assurance loop can see. Third, does the post-incident review seek learning or accountability for blame? When people fear that speaking up about a failure means becoming responsible for it, they stop speaking up. The loop starves. Perfect policies won't produce resilience if the culture rewards covering up problems. This is why behavioral signals, whether people feel safe raising concerns, whether near misses travel up the organization, whether post-incident reviews are genuinely curious rather than politically charged, are treated as critical, observable evidence about whether the system is working. Human behavior isn't a soft consideration alongside the real governance work. It is the governance work at the most fundamental level. None of what this session has described means that established frameworks lose their value. They don't. NIST CSF ISO 27001, PCI DSS, sector-specific regulations, these represent accumulated knowledge about what deserves attention. They reflect real risk experience, real regulatory expectations, and real collective learning from failures across industries and over time. What changes is their role. Frameworks are catalogs of what deserves attention. They are not operating models. The distinction matters because a catalog tells you what to pay attention to, but doesn't tell you how to manage it in practice at a specific boundary under real conditions. The 7 capabilities are what translate framework guidance into operational reality. When a new regulation arrives, when the regulatory environment shifts and new requirements appear, the operating overlay absorbs that change without losing governance coherence. The new guidance routes through the existing capabilities at the relevant boundaries. It updates the outcome measure pairs where they apply. It doesn't require rebuilding the governance structure from scratch. This is one of the most practical advantages of the overlay approach. Regulatory change becomes an update to a living system, rather than a trigger for another compliance program. The capabilities are stable. What flows through them is updated as the environment changes. That stability across change is what separates the two approaches most clearly. Here's the full comparison laid out plainly. In the old paradigm, the focus is compliance, static catalogs, and audits. The unit of analysis is frameworks and departments. Culture is defined by accountability for blame, and the cover-ups that follow from it. The result is green dashboards coexisting with failing boundaries, a system that looks healthy from above and misbehaves at its edges. In the approach this series describes, the focus shifts to resilience, living systems, and continuous learning. The unit of analysis shifts to critical operational boundaries, the specific points where risk concentrates and governance intent meets human behavior. Culture shifts from accountability for blame to behavioral signals treated as system evidence. And the result is living systems that adapt and heal from anomalies, rather than systems that record them and move on. The goal of this shift is stated directly: transform governance from a system that documents events into a system that learns from them. That transformation doesn't require replacing everything in place. It requires changing what governance is for. Not the production of artifacts that satisfy external requirements, but the generation of evidence that improves internal decisions. And that change in purpose produces a completely different picture of what the organization actually is. The mental map that most leaders carry looks something like this: departments, projects, frameworks, audit cycles. Things organized into categories, managed in separate tracks, reviewed on separate schedules. Here's a different map. Instead of isolated departments, a living network of critical boundaries, each one glowing with its own learning loop, each one connected to the others through the evidence it produces and shares. Instead of temporary projects, continuous cycles: intent, capability, evidence, learning, running in parallel at every boundary that matters. Instead of static frameworks, dynamic guidance that flows through stable capabilities, updating as the environment changes without requiring a governance rebuild each time. The call to action is simple and precise. Stop accumulating surprises. Start accumulating knowledge.